And that's what happened in the Lochner case. Mr. Lochner wanted to work overtime, and Mr. Schmitter wanted to work overtime, and Mr. Lochner said that was okay with him. And he was reported for violating the New York maximum hours law, and it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that this law was unconstitutional as a violation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Why? Because grown human beings, grown adults, have the right to decide for themselves what to do with their own bodies, including the right to decide what kind of jobs to take, what kind of hours to work, and what kind of wages to earn, and that sort of thing. And nobody else has the right to interfere with that. Now, if what they're doing hurts another person, then yes, the government can protect you. For instance, if you're hiring some, a mafia guy to go kill somebody, I mean, obviously the government has the right to protect the public good by prohibiting those kinds of contracts. But there was no evidence in the Lochner case that working overtime was bad for bakers or bad for the public or anything like that. It was simply an arbitrary deprivation of economic opportunity, and therefore, because it was arbitrary, it violated the Due Process of Law Clause of the Constitution. That's the Lochner case, which is today regarded as the most evil decision of the Supreme Court, with the exception of Dred Scott. Why? Why is the Lochner case regarded with such horror by the legal elite today? Well, the answer to that, and the answer to another question, is what you're thinking right now. What you're thinking is, wait a minute, that Loan Association versus Topeka case, you can't take property from one person and give it to another? Then how do we have things like that Kelo case about eminent domain and stuff, right? The answer to that is the big change that happened in American constitutional law that is attributable to the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Now, the progressives were a group of intellectuals that began in about the 1880s or so, and they had these radical new ideas for how government should work. See, they said, the American founders, they thought that we all have certain inherent rights and that government protects our rights and all that sort of... No, that was all just superstition. It's been outdated. Science and history have taught us these brand new ideas for how government should work. And they had 4 big ideas. The first big progressive idea was rights are just permissions. Rights are just permissions that government gives you for government's own purposes. And the great advocate of this was Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the worst human beings ever to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. One of the most overrated intellectuals in American history. I do not understand why people think Holmes was a great guy. I think it was the mustache. No other explanation. But Holmes had this idea that rights are just permissions that government gives you and can take away when it wants to. So he wrote this decision. He wrote an opinion in a case called Abrams versus United States. It's a very famous case because of the phrase marketplace of ideas. You often hear that phrase thrown around. That's where that phrase comes from. And what he says, a lot of law professors will tell you, Abrams, that has a great free speech opinion. A defense of freedom of speech. Actually, when you read his opinion, one of the first lines in it is, persecution seems perfectly logical to me. Then he says, but we don't persecute people because it's good for society to have a debate, and so we allow people to discuss things amongst themselves. But of course we can deprive them of that right if we want to. And so he also wrote a case called Shank versus United States, which is also famous because he used the phrase yelling fire in a crowded theater. You've heard that phrase, right? That's where that comes from. He said you can throw people in jail if what they're doing is imminently likely to cause law breaking. What Mr. Shank was doing in that case was handing out pamphlets on how not to be drafted into the army. Well, that's obviously just like yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? And Holmes said you can throw him in jail for that. So Holmes' idea, and the idea shared by the progressives, was rights are just permissions government gives you. The second great progressive idea was government exists to make society nice. Now, the Founding Fathers didn't think so. The Founding Fathers thought government existed to protect individual rights. Thomas Jefferson famously said, the sum of good government is one which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. But that's not what the progressives thought. No. Government exists to make society nice, to make it pleasant and interesting. So they came up with all sorts of new ideas for how to make society nice, like segregation, prohibition, eugenics, zoning. Anybody know what zoning was originally devised to do? Professor Nadelson, what was zoning originally invented to do?
Keep the undesirables away from the rest of us.
Exactly. It was designed to keep racial minorities out of white neighborhoods. Of course, we never use it for that purpose today, right? In fact, in the eminent domain context, you've probably heard of neighborhoods being called blighted, right? The progressives were the first to use the term blight when describing neighborhood. The term blight refers to a plant disease. But that's how the progressives thought, that government was like a gardener that went around pruning and shaping society and making it into the form that we want. And so when a neighborhood fails to perform up to the standard we want it to, then it's blighted and needs to be cured by the government. So that was the second great progressive idea, is government exists to make society nice. The third great progressive idea was judicial restraint. And unfortunately, this is an idea a lot of my conservative friends have also adopted. But what judicial restraint really means is, when the legislature violates your rights, courts should do nothing about it. Right? If you want a great example of judicial restraint, it's Kelo versus New London. Government's going to steal Suzette Kelo's house and give it to a developer. The court says, well, we're not going to be activist. We're going to stand back and not do anything. Right? That's judicial restraint. Korematsu versus United States, when they said they could throw the Japanese Americans in prison camps. Right? The court says, we're not going to be activists. We're going to sit back and do nothing. Buck versus Bell. It's a great decision, another Oliver Wendell Holmes classic, where Holmes said that the government can force women to undergo sterilization operations against their will. No, we, the court, are not going to interfere. That's judicial restraint. I always say that's why Lady Justice is blindfolded. She's using judicial restraint. I don't care. Right. And then the fourth great progressive idea was the living Constitution. The idea that the Constitution changes and bends and changes with every day. It doesn't mean today what it meant yesterday. It's not worth the paper it's printed on, and so forth and so on. And these four great progressive ideas were really well articulated by Louis Brandeis, another awful Supreme Court justice, who said, private property and other rights of the individual must be remolded from time to time to meet the changing needs of society. I always love that word, remolded. What a great euphemism for violated. Right? Oh no, the government wasn't violating your rights. They were remolding your rights. When the government steals Suzette Kelo's house to give it to a developer, it's not violating her rights. It's just remolding her rights to meet society's needs. You know, if it can be remolded to meet society's needs, it's not a right. It's a privilege. Right? So that was a great progressive movement. And now these ideas originally were not very popular. They were mostly in dissenting opinions. Holmes wrote all these he dissented in Lochner versus New York. Brandeis wrote all these dissenting opinions. It wasn't until 1934 that these progressive ideas became constitutional law in the United States in a case called Nebbia versus New York. And I love talking about this case because it's so stupid. Okay, so it's the Great Depression, right? 1934. Unemployment in New York in 1934 is like 25%, right? And you look out your window and you see all these soup kitchens, these bread lines and whatnot. The solution to this problem is obvious, right? I mean, it couldn't be clearer how we're going to solve this problem. We have to make food more expensive, right? I mean, obviously. So that's what they did. That's what the state of New York does, is it passes a law saying it's illegal to charge less than 8 cents a quart for milk. And Leo Nebbia charges less than 8 cents a quart for milk at his Rochester grocery store. And he's brought up on charges, and it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, yeah, you can punish him for that. Because if the government wants to regulate the economy, it can do virtually anything it wants to. And this was the birth of what lawyers call the rational basis test. Now this is a term that you have to remember, the rational basis test. This is the test that courts use to evaluate the constitutionality of laws that restrict private property rights or your economic freedom. And the rational basis test, so what happens is, like in my pigeon case, I file this lawsuit, I say this law is unconstitutional. They use the rational basis test and they say, well, is this law rationally related to a legitimate government interest? That's the phrase that lawyers use. Is it rationally related to a legitimate government? Okay, what is a legitimate government interest? Anybody? That's the right answer. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. In 1987, in Nolan versus California Coastal Commission, the U.S. Supreme Court said our cases have not laid out the standards for determining what is a legitimate state interest. Think about what that means. 2 centuries after the Constitution of the United States, the Supreme Court doesn't know what government exists to do. And if we don't know what a legitimate state interest is, how do we know whether a law is rationally related to it? right? Isn't that like having a map for the wrong state? I mean, you can't tell whether a law is rational if you don't know what it's supposed to do, right?